Now that we've given an overview of the major fronts of fighting during World War I, we're going to be turning our attention to the practices of warfare in World War I, starting with land warfare. We've already mentioned both the Western Front and the role of trenches in previous recordings, but I want to turn your attention again as to why the Western Front was more significant in World War I as compared to the Eastern Front or the other quote-unquote diversionary fronts in the Balkans, in the Middle East, and even in the colonies. If you look at page 49, it gives you a list of reasons why the Western Front was more significant to the fighting of World War I and the outcome in the end. If you look at some of these reasons, they include things like the size and length of time that this front was open. It was the only front to last the entire 4 years of the war. It was continuous. Time and again, the enemies made attacks upon each other and were there constantly trying to break the position of the line. The Western Front was also key in the outcome of the war, as some of the other fronts were considered diversionary to break the deadlock on the Western Front. And then finally, the fighting that took place on World War I was more significant in changing people's attitudes and ideas about what constitutes warfare and the concept of total warfare itself. Now let's turn our attention to the trenches and the stalemates that developed. In class, we'll be viewing a video about trench warfare and an article so that you can see some of the details of the horrific conditions that soldiers had to face in trenches. But also in your book on pages 49 to 50, there are several things that you can pay attention to. On page 49, it gives you a list of reasons why trench warfare led to stalemate on the Western Front. These things included the fact that there was not a possibility of a war of movement because of development of new war supplies such as machine gun fire, which forced soldiers to dig down into ditches to try to hold their positions. So it became more of a defensive war rather than an offensive war. If you look at the quote by John Keegan at the bottom of page 49, he gives you a pretty good idea in his book, The First World War, of what it was like to set up these complex systems of trenches between the two enemies. You can also see at the bottom of page 49 a diagram that showed the key features of the trench warfare system, including things like the parapet, which were mentioned in several other things that we've seen in class, barbed wire, and the internal features of the trench. On the top of page 50, you can see the stages of trench warfare and the fact that it was much more deadly for the attackers than the defenders. It talks about how a major attack would begin and then what the soldiers would have to do to try to make any type of advance. It was very risky, and oftentimes those who were attackers suffered far more casualties than those who were just trying to defend their trench. John Keegan again quotes on page 50 what it was like for soldiers fighting in the trenches and the barrage of gunfire and other things that they had to face with the trench warfare system. So take a minute to read that for yourself. So after a full analysis of the trench warfare system, it's easy to see why there was a little change in the position on the front for an entire 4 years. Therefore, it shows that the war on the Western Front anyways was a war of attrition, meaning that you were just trying to wear your enemy down to the point where they could no longer defend their trench, and which would wear down their morale as well, instead of a war of lightning movement and quick attacks and rapid gain of territory. Finally, in our discussion of land warfare in World War I want to turn our attention to some of the new or better developed weapons that were seen during this war, starting with machine guns. These weapons were capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, as opposed to a traditional rifle, which could only fire approximately 25 rounds per minute. Additionally, heavy artillery, things such as cannons, inflicted about 70% of the casualties in World War I. According to the bottom of page 51, these huge guns and cannons could take up permanent positions in strategically good locations and launch massive numbers of shells. And therefore, commanders saw them as the key to trying to overcome defenses of the enemy. There were tactics that evolved throughout the course of the war to try to combat these artillery gunfire, and you can see these on the top of page 52 in the paragraph that starts with artillery tactics and fire control. Men had to adjust the way that they had to respond to these artillery and use strategies such as creeping barrages in order to try to go against these huge guns that were pointed right at them. Something else significant about heavy artillery is the development of the term that we know as shell shock. Because of the huge amounts of shells that were exploding in soldiers' ears every single day during these fights across the 4-year span of the war, soldiers suffered from brain damage and bleeding ears and just an overall psychological wearing down, in a term that was eventually known as shell shock. Soldiers would have to be treated for this condition, and it was also seen in wars that would come. Additionally, there were several types of grenades that were used in the trench fighting. The Allies usually used small, rounded ones, almost pineapple-shaped, called a Mills bomb, and the Germans used ones that looked like they were on a stick, and they were nicknamed potato mashers. These were highly effective in trying to clear out an enemy trench. Next, let's look at some of the chemical warfare. The first poison gas attack was made in 1915 by the Germans at the Battle of Ypres. And basically the gas itself developed throughout the course of the war, going from not as deadly to ones that could kill you within the matter of a couple seconds. The most highly feared gas of all was mustard gas, which would burn or blind and slowly kill the victim over several weeks rather than immediately. And obviously you can see why that would be less desirable than a gas that would kill you instantly. Other types of gas were used, such as chlorine gas, phosgene gas, and these basically were meant to try to clear out a trench, similar to grenades, and so soldiers had to develop technologies that would try to combat this, such as gas masks. Different things were tried in gas masks to try to filter out the poison, including items as simple as a peach pit. So while soldiers had to deal with the gas coming into their trench, it did not effectively break the stalemate. It was more successful in causing panic among your enemy. Finally, tanks were used for the first time in World War I as an attempt to break the stalemate. If you look at the bottom of page 52, you can see the benefits but also limitations of the tank. The main purpose of the tank was to advance ahead of the infantry so it could mow down barbed wire fences and attack at the same time by shooting out machine gun and cannon fire. The crew inside the tank would be protected, but because of its pace being very slow, a lot of the tanks broke down and were not the most reliable. And sometimes their plating on the outside of the tank wasn't strong enough to resist heavy artillery, such as a cannon. The conditions inside the tank were not that desirable either. It wasn't really until World War II that this mechanical warfare use of tanks would be very successful. They were pretty limited in World War I. Now you have a pretty good idea of the fighting on land in World War I and the fact that the trenches were the key feature of it. In the next recording, we'll be talking about the warfare at sea and, for the first time, war in the air.